The Brave Little Toaster is an underrated gem of a movie. I doubt that this movie would make the top 10 best animated movies that are gonna be reviewed for Sean's yearly reviews, and it's certainly not top 10 best Disney movie material. But this movie is quite an interesting endeavor, I must say, in a way that could be considered a bit of a double-edged sword. So, what is The Brave Little Toaster about? This movie revolves around a group of household appliances, a female toaster, a talking radio, a lamp, a blanket, and a vacuum cleaner that is literally named Kirby. No, I am not joking. They've been abandoned for years in a cottage that a human named Rob McGrody, whom they call the Master, had left abandoned for years. One day they had enough and decided to go out on their own to find the Master themselves. Meanwhile, running into several bizarre characters, some characters themselves even being nightmare fuel. Now, similarly to animated shows like DuckTales, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Garfield and Friends, there are animated movies from the late 80s to the early 90s that help define a specific kind of animated film from all kinds of areas in Disney. Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a stepping stone for Disney to get a little more comedic with films like Aladdin and Hercules, while The Little Mermaid was a stepping stone for Disney movies to be more music-based in the 90s. For The Brave Little Toaster, I'd say that this movie was a stepping stone for Pixar, to the point where this movie feels like a Pixar movie, except it's done in 2D, and is closer to a Disney movie, given that this movie also contributes as a musical. I mean, there are only 4 songs, unless you count the one song at the beginning, which is a pre-existing song, and this particular Pixar feeling that the movie has does make sense considering the production that the movie was in. You see, back then, Disney was not nearly as thrilled about CGI as they are now. John Lasseter ended up being fired from his position at Disney back then because of the fact that they thought that the CGI would be too expensive to produce. And John Lasseter pitched a movie based on the novel The Brave Little Toaster and pitched it as a computer animated movie before he was fired. But then the movie was transferred to other people who would then work on the movie, including Joe Ranft, whom you might recognize as another person who would work at Pixar. And when watching the movie for this review, it made me realize that this movie is pretty much a predecessor to a Pixar movie, as this movie pretty much reminds me of Toy Story, except instead of toys, it's household appliances. It even has a little Easter egg that Pixar movies would have later on, as Rob McGrody's apartment building is numbered A113. But getting into the contents of the movie itself, there is one thing I'd like to get off my chest about with this movie. That being the fact that this movie does have a pretty similar issue as Monster Family, where the characters at times devote entire sequences to fighting and bickering at each other, to the point where it could make the movie pretty draining to watch. Although the characters' feelings towards each other does lighten up around the time when the main characters get captured by this greedy sales guy who wants to use their parts to sell them to other people. And also, unlike with Monster Family, these characters are not related to each other, and the film is not trying to tell a message about how these characters are close and that they love each other as a family. The characters in this movie are not at all related, and to be honest, the characters do things to each other to warrant said argument. And also, there's someone in this group of characters to help prevent the movie from going too far with the characters bickering at each other in a mean-spirited way, that being Toaster. She always stops them before things get out of hand, but also trying to be much more kind than those who are fighting each other. Already a much better character than Emma from Monster Family. The furthest point that this movie went to in terms of its mean-spirited angle was with Kirby. At the beginning of the movie, when Blanket is crying hard because the car that went past the house wasn't the Master, Kirby tries to suck up the picture of the Master that Blanket has in his hands before unintentionally smashing the picture frame onto the ground. And there's one part where Kirby snaps at all of them when they get to the waterfall, but people tend to do and say things they'll regret while under extreme levels of stress or anger, and the movie does show that Kirby didn't mean to say that he'd be better off without the others because of the fact that he gets overwhelmed by the fact that they're near a waterfall, and if he did mean to say that he'd be better off without the others, he wouldn't dive off the edge of the waterfall to go and save them, already being a much better showcase of anger in the heat of the moment than the one in Monster Family, because Kirby legitimately doesn't mean it, while Emma does, considering the fact that she acts like that throughout that film's runtime. And also, something that actually surprised me when going into this movie for the first time is that, like Adorabat from Mau Mau Here's a Pure Heart, I actually didn't realize that Toaster was supposed to be a female until actually watching the movie. Although, unlike Cow from Cow and Chicken or Double D from Ed, Edd n Eddy, it's debated to this day whether Toaster is supposed to be a female or not. I'd say that she is, considering the fact that she's not only voiced by a female voice actress, but her voice sounds feminine as well. But regardless of if she's male or female, she's very solid for what she is. She's not very interesting as a character. In fact, none of the main characters have more than their one character trait, except for maybe Kirby, but Toaster is still a decent character, as she has this determination to get back together with her and the other character's master. Also, I do like how she's one of the few characters that does treat Blanket with respect, while the others basically belittle him and call him a baby, and also her sacrificing herself to save her master. Although, the characters are not really supposed to have much to them, because the characters are not what drives this movie. What drives the movie is the journey and the bizarre things that the characters come across along the way. An interesting note to bring up about this movie is that it's not on Disney+, and yet both of the sequels are, and I honestly have no clue as to why. Maybe Disney regrets this movie? Well, honestly, that can't be the case, because looking at Disney Plus for myself, I searched up every possible movie that Disney regrets or they don't acknowledge much anymore. They do have those particular movies on the exact same service. The Black Cauldron, that movie is on there. Home on the Range, that's on there too. Mars Needs Moms, do I even need to say yes? And heck, even Strange Magic, which they tried desperately hard to ignore to the point where they used the Touchstone Pictures banner so people wouldn't consider it a Disney movie, that is on there too. Or it might have something to do with the fact that this movie is extremely dark, although that would still be a questionable decision because Disney has gotten to the point of being dark before. A year after this movie, Oliver and Company came out, where the climax had the villain be killed by a train. Although, for a movie that is titled The Brave Little Toaster, which sounds like a goofy premise, this movie has some very intense scenes that could be considered nightmare fuel for any unsuspecting viewers. So much so that this movie is again like Toy Story, but a whole lot more dark than either one of the four films combined. The most dark that any of the Toy Story movies have ever gotten were like, what? Sequences that were set in a sadistic child's room where he messes up toys and make them look deformed in the first movie, a nightmare sequence where Woody drowns in a sea of hands in a trash can in the second movie, and the incinerator sequence in the third movie. Remember back during my review on Code Lyoko where I stated that Code Lyoko had constant moments where it gets intense and dark at every moment? That's pretty much The Brave Little Toaster, but only to a lesser extent, because this movie is only an hour long as opposed to multiple hours long. When it comes to The Brave Little Toaster, you know those extremely disturbing deleted scenes from the Pixar movie Cars, where lightning comes across a bunch of broken down cars in a graveyard? The Brave Little Toaster is filled to the brim with sequences that are like this. They might not be that scary, considering the fact that these characters are appliances, but imagine real quick if said appliances were humans. That's what makes the nightmare fuel that this movie has even bigger. One sequence of this movie has a blender get ripped apart, due to the store owner needing to use his insights to sell it to one of his customers. And you could see this blender fearing for his life before getting completely ripped apart. And the same thing was going to happen to the radio if the others didn't do something about him. And speaking of cars, there's also this very disturbing sequence that is tied to a very catchy song where a bunch of cars talk about how worthless they are before getting smashed into cubes. One car even decides to commit self-deletion by directly driving onto the conveyor belt to get smashed into a cube. The trash magnet even attempts to kill the master when he goes to retrieve his appliances. And these two moments are only scraping the surface. There's also the beginning where the air conditioner has a heart attack on screen because the others said that Rob didn't play with the air conditioner. Or that one moment during the thunderstorm where Lampy hurts himself in order to recharge the portable battery, and in the aftermath of him hurting himself, he looks very damaged. Oh, and since I mentioned the songs, even though there are only 4 of them in this movie, they simply slap. The only song in this movie that is kind of forgettable is the song titled Cutting Edge.
wanted more.
But the rest of them I could listen to over and over again and never get tired of. The first song, titled City of Light, is a standard road trip song where the characters travel across the land, as the characters say in the song, but the song gives out a good feeling because of the enthusiastic rhythm.
And I'd be satisfied just to be not denied, but a ride to the city of light.
The second song, titled It's a B Movie, is the second best song of the movie. A lot of people remember Worthless more because of its catchy beat, but this song comes close as it has a pretty creepy aura to it, but also a cool techno beat to it.
It's like a movie. It's a B-movie show.
I still remember this song to this very day. And lastly, Worthless, which is a disturbing yet awesome song set to a jamming beat. This is the most well-known song of the movie, and for very good reason.
Once took a Texan to a wedding. Once took a Texan to a wedding. He kept forgetting his loneliness, letting his thoughts turn to home and return.
There are unfortunately some issues that this movie has to prevent it from being like an 8 out of 10 and is just a 7 out of 10 now. For starters, the movie does take a little too long to introduce us to the master that they've been hyping up for the whole movie, and all we really know about him is that he's just a regular guy that graduated high school and wants to take the appliances that were over at the cottage over to college. If I were to say where the movie could have let us know a little bit more about the master and how he is as a character, I'd honestly say that maybe they should have cut out the sequence where they goof around with the frogs, a fish, and a bird that tries to catch a worm, and cut away to the master and how he's like back at his home in the city. Using another similar character as an example, with Andy from Toy Story, the movie at several different sections cuts to Andy to see what conflicts he goes through in the movie, the only exceptions being the second and third movie, as they both have Andy being absent for most of the movie, or all of the toys being in somewhere else, namely at Sunnyside in the third movie. The most that we get with the master is a few flashbacks, but those scenes don't really tell us about who he actually is, and one of those sequences was in a nightmare that Toaster has, where the master gets eaten by a sadistic clown. And also, speaking of character writing, there's one sequence that is more sad than dark, where Toaster comes across this flower that sees itself in a reflection, and the flower slowly dies alone, and then she realizes that she needs to treat Blanket better, even though she didn't really treat him that bad, and the movie didn't really show us any instances where she treated him bad, except for maybe that one moment where she refuses to let Blanket sleep with her. But overall, The Brave Little Toaster is a good movie, that I'd say is like a Pixar movie mixed with the tone of a Disney movie. If you guys want to see an animated movie that is creative, dark, and has catchy songs, I'd say check this movie out. I wasn't really sure as to why this movie fell under the radar back then and the movie wasn't given much attention. Maybe it was because of the first poster, or maybe it was due to the animation, since it was on par with television animation, or that the movie didn't get released on VHS until the early 90s. Or it could have also been because of the fact that this movie was released on Disney Channel before anywhere else, but I am glad that this movie has gotten a cult following in recent years. It may not be as good as the Toy Story movies, since the characters in that movie go beyond just being toys, but The Brave Little Toaster is an enjoyable experience. Although, just be warned that there are some dark scenes as well as some very dark undertones, but if you could get past all of that, I think you guys will enjoy this movie and get a little bit of Pixar history that you'll have knowledge on. And unlike Rock Dog and Monster Family, this movie won't leave you feeling bored, and it knows how to do characters fighting each other without going too far with it. And it's the definition of a don't judge a book by its cover movie.